I stood in my kitchen in Leimert Park, watching the Los Angeles morning sun pour through the window and fall in long streaks across the hardwood floor, darkened by years. The coffee in my hand had gone cold who knew when. The bitter taste clung to the tip of my tongue, metallic and raw, like the tang of iron in my mouth. The clock read exactly 6 a.m. That was usually the hour I kept for silence. I would sit still, listen to the house breathe, count each creak of wood, each beat of time slipping by. But this morning, the silence was different. It was heavy, pressing straight onto my chest, making every breath feel forced. In the corner, the old heater ticked and clattered in its steady rhythm, a familiar, lonely sound that had become my only companion since I retired from the public library. 40 years of my life had passed among the whispers of books, sorting and protecting other people's stories. I never thought I would live to realize that the most terrifying thing is when your own story suddenly stops. My phone lay on the granite counter, its screen lighting up again and again, stubbornly, as if it were mocking me. Tristan. I stared at that name for 3 full minutes. 3 minutes so long I could hear my own heartbeat pounding inside my ears. When I finally reached out and swiped the screen, my fingers trembled. I hated myself for it. Why should a mother tremble when her only son calls? "Hello, Tristan," I said. My voice was thin and dry, like old paper that might tear if I spoke even a little louder. "Hi, Mom," he replied. On the other end, I heard the soft clink of utensils, the set down of a glass, and somewhere farther back, the low murmur of a jazz band. It sounded like wealth. It sounded like a luxurious world I had never been invited into. "Listen," Tristan continued, careful. "I'm calling to tell you before you see it on social media. We did it." I tightened my grip around the cold cup. "We got married yesterday, at a resort in Newport Beach." The air left my lungs in a short, silent pull, as if someone had yanked my breath out of my body. Yesterday. The word dropped into my stomach like a punch. I turned my head toward the small calendar on the wall, the one where I'd circled Tristan's wedding date for months. A date he himself had told me was still being decided. I had bought a dress, a simple, modest navy silk dress, elegant enough not to embarrass him. Now it was still hanging untouched in my closet, sealed beneath a clear plastic cover, a shroud for a ghost who would never walk. "You got married?" I whispered. "Yesterday." Tristan cleared his throat softly. In his voice I heard hesitation and a kind of calculated coldness, the kind he'd learned from Ainsley and her family. "We decided to keep the ceremony very private, Mom. The Pembrokes, they had a very specific vision for this event. They wanted a certain atmosphere, high-end, cohesive, you know." I stayed silent. They felt that if there were too many guests from different backgrounds, it would disrupt the flow. Ainsley's parents, they're simply more deserving to be in that circle. They understand these nuances. It was a private ceremony for people who truly fit the aesthetic. Deserving. The word echoed inside my head, bouncing off the walls of this small kitchen. I thought about 30 years of double shifts at the UCLA library so Tristan could attend the best schools. I thought about the winters I wore the same old coat, frayed until it barely held warmth, just so he could have the newest sneakers, the newest laptop, a life like a boy who had never tasted poverty. I thought about the night his father died of a heart attack, right here in this kitchen. I held Tristan for 12 straight hours, promising I would be his anchor, that even if the world collapsed, he would never have to be alone. I was deserving enough to pay for his whole life, but not deserving enough to witness him begin a new one. "I understand," I said. I didn't cry. The pain was too deep for tears. It was numbness, sharp, icy, starting in the marrow and spreading through my entire body. "You don't think I'd fit that aesthetic?" "It's not like that, Mom," Tristan shot back quickly, his voice rising with that familiar defensive irritation. "Don't turn this into drama. This is a logistical decision." He paused. "We'll host a small brunch for more extended family in the summer. You'll be invited. It will suit you better, less pressure." A small brunch, the leftovers of the affection he had for me. I looked down at my hands. Age spots speckled the skin. My nails were short, practical. These were the hands that scrubbed floors for him, turned pages of bedtime stories, pinched pennies into a trust fund, one he drained the moment he turned 25. Is Ainsley happy? I asked. I didn't know why I still cared. Maybe because the librarian in me always needed to make sure that, at the very least, an ending had order. She's radiant, Tristan said. In his voice I heard genuine tenderness, the same tone he once used with me when he was 10 years old. Then he lowered his voice. But listen, Mom, I'm calling because there's something else. The wedding was wonderful, but there's a small financial hiccup. I closed my eyes. I knew what was coming. The Pembrokes had some last-minute liquidity issues. A few offshore accounts were frozen for routine auditing. Nothing serious, just timing. A script I'd read too many times. The venue and catering have to be paid by noon today, he continued. Total is $65,000. I told Ainsley not to worry. My mother always supports me. It's just a loan. When the Pembrokes clear the audit, they'll pay you back, with interest. I heard a keyboard clicking on his end. I just sent the invoice to your email. You can wire it from the secondary retirement account, right? This is urgent, Mom. The venue manager is getting really upset. $65,000. The number hung in the air like a heavy curtain. It was almost exactly everything left in my supplemental retirement fund. My final safety net, the money I'd saved so I wouldn't have to depend on Tristan when my knees couldn't hold anymore or when this old roof started to leak. He was asking for my survival, to pay for a party I wasn't good enough to attend. I opened my laptop. The email was already there. An attachment from a luxury wedding planning firm in Newport Beach. Embossed logo. Elegant. The total at the bottom was presented in a clean, sans serif font. Beautiful. Almost emotionless. $65,000. For flowers that would wilt in a day. For champagne no one would remember the taste of the next morning. For the deservingness of a family that couldn't even pay their own bill. Mom, are you still there? Tristan asked. I remembered a rainy Tuesday 20 years ago. Tristan was 12. He wanted a charcoal suit for a school dance, $300. I didn't have $300. I worked 4 extra hours every night for a month, shelving books until my back screamed, just to watch my son step out the door in that suit, head high, feeling like he belonged. I remembered his eyes then, full of pride, when he told me I was the greatest mother in the world. Where had that boy gone? Had he been buried beneath Ainsley's expensive silk and the Pembrokes' hollow prestige? I'm here, Tristan, I said. I took a sip of the cold coffee. It was terrible. I'll look at the invoice. Great, he said quickly. I knew I could count on you. I have to go. We're heading to the airport for our honeymoon, Maui. We'll talk when I'm back, okay? Love you. He hung up. The dull beep sounded in my kitchen. Love you. The word sounded like a transaction. A tip left on the table after a meal. I stood motionless in my Leimert Park kitchen as the Los Angeles sun finally broke through a thin layer of cloud. But it didn't feel like morning. It felt like the end of a long, exhausted day. I walked into the living room and sat in the chair that had once been my husband's. The house suddenly felt too large. Every creak in the floorboards seemed to whisper one word, not deserving. I looked at the photos on the mantel. Tristan at graduation, Tristan at his first job. Tristan and Ainsley at their engagement party. A party where I'd been placed at a small table in the corner near the kitchen, kept out of sight of the important guests. I smiled that day. I told myself this was just how things were now. I excused his neglect as ambition. I excused his coldness with the word growing up. But $65,000 wasn't a request for help. It was a demand for sacrifice. He wanted me to pay for the privilege of being erased. He wanted me to finance the very circle that excluded me. I reopened the email. The invoice listed every item in detail. $10,000 for flowers, $15,000 for a 5-course dinner, $12,000 for a premium bar. My vision blurred as I read. This was the price of his new life. This was the cost of his deservingness. I remembered the smell of the library, the scent of old glue and dust. I remembered the hundreds of thousands of books I'd lifted in my arms, their weight against my chest. I had built a life out of quiet, steady labor. I had built a home out of honesty and grit, and my son had turned it all into a currency to spend on people who despised the very hands that raised him. I opened my closet and pulled out the navy silk dress. I tore off the plastic cover. The fabric was soft, cool, expensive, a deep blue like the Pacific on a clear day. I had spent weeks finding the right shoes, the right pearl earrings. I had imagined the moment I'd see Tristan standing at the altar, imagined the warmth in his eyes when he saw his mother in the front row. I threw the dress onto the floor. It lay there, crumpled into a beautiful but useless heap of silk, and in that moment I realized, to them, I wasn't a person. I was a resource, a backup plan, a silent, invisible foundation they assumed they had the right to build their towers on. But even the strongest foundation can bear only so much before it begins to crack. I sat at my desk and logged into my bank account. My retirement fund appeared, $68,412. If I paid that invoice, I would have $3,000 left, $3,000 for the rest of my life. I thought of Jacqueline Pembroke, Ainsley's mother. I remembered her look the only time she visited my home. She tilted her head, wearing a pitying smile on a face perfected by Botox. "Oh, charmingly vintage, Marcia," she said. "It must be such work to maintain. I imagine you're eager to move into a well-managed condo." She wanted this house. She wanted my son. She wanted my silence. And Tristan was handing it all to her, piece by piece, dollar by dollar. I did not wire the money. I closed the laptop, went back to the kitchen, poured the cold coffee into the sink, and watched it swirl and disappear. It hit me then that for years I'd been trying to fit myself into a story that didn't even include a character named Mother. I had been trying to buy my way into a heart that had already been sold to the highest bidder. My phone buzzed. A text from Tristan. "Did you do it yet?" "The organizer keeps calling me. Hurry, we're about to board." I didn't answer. I stepped outside and stood beneath the harsh Los Angeles sun. The light cut through my thin sweater, hot and undeniable. For the first time in a very long time, I wasn't cataloging someone else's story anymore. I began to understand that the most important book in the library was the one I had neglected for years, my own story. The $65,000 invoice still sat in my inbox like a countdown clock for Tristan's vanity. But standing there in that Los Angeles sunlight, I knew the price of deservingness was something I could no longer pay. Not because I didn't have the money, but because I had finally found my own value again. And that value was not for sale. If you think it ends here, you're wrong. Because when I refused to send the money, the Pembrokes didn't back off. They began stepping into my home with polite smiles, offers to help, and a plan far darker than anything I could have imagined. Rain in Los Angeles is rare, but when it comes, it doesn't just fall and leave. It stays, it settles, it seeps into the cracks in the sidewalk, into the porous gaps between bricks, and into the hollow spaces inside a person's chest. I sat by the living room window, watching droplets slam down the glass as if racing one another, dragging gray streaks across a world that already looked washed out. My phone lay on the coffee table, silent now, but the feeling of it wasn't silent at all. It was like a time bomb, waiting to explode with the next vibration. I had just hung up with Julian, the wedding organizer, and the moment I did, it felt as if I'd severed a cord I hadn't even known was holding my world together. For 40 years, I lived like a woman who arranged order, shelving books, classifying, organizing chaos, making sure every story had its proper place. But now, my own history lay scattered across the floor, and its spine was broken. No amount of endurance could stitch it back together. I looked down at my hands again. The skin was red and cracked from the morning cold, and then my mind, without my permission, slid backward into the past, skimming through decades like a film snagged on a jagged gear. 20 years ago, it was also a Tuesday, cold and unforgiving, just like today. Tristan was 12 then, a thin boy whose eyes still looked at me as if I were the sun. He ran home with a flyer for the school dance. His face was bright, but inside his excitement there was something desperate and silent. He wanted a charcoal suit, not second-hand clothes from the thrift shop on Crenshaw. He wanted a real suit, a $300 suit from the department store. I remember that night perfectly, opening my bank account. Balance, $14. But I didn't say no. I never said no. I picked up extra nighttime shelving shifts at the UCLA library and 3 more hours scrubbing grease out of the vents at a diner near Crenshaw. I remember the smell of that diner, stale oil, suffocating heat, and cheap cleaner that clung to my skin, a smell that no matter how many times I washed, never fully disappeared. I worked until my back felt like a rusted hinge. I worked until my eyes burned from fluorescent lights and fine dust from thousands of old books. And then, the day I walked into that store and counted each wrinkled 20 and 10 in my hand, I felt like a queen. I remember Tristan standing in this very living room, wearing that charcoal suit. He adjusted his tie in the mirror, chest lifted with a dignity he'd just discovered. Then he turned to me, eyes wet with the raw gratitude of a child, and whispered, "Mom, you're the best. One day I'm going to buy you a castle. I'll make sure you never have to work again." That boy is a ghost now. My phone buzzed. A notification flashed, an email from Tristan, but the subject line wasn't an apology. It was, "Re-urgent wire instructions." I opened it. The boldness of his words made the room feel smaller, as if the air itself was being squeezed. "Mom, Julian said there's a misunderstanding. I don't have time for this. We're literally at the gate to Maui. Ainsley is stressed, and Jacqueline, her mother, is already asking questions. Do you know how humiliating this makes me look?" The Pembrokes expect to be handled with a certain level of professionalism. You're making me look like a child. Just send the wire. I'll explain when we get back. Please, for once, don't be difficult. Don't be difficult. The words hit like a slap. I was being difficult because I didn't want to bankrupt myself for a party I wasn't even deserving enough to enter. And then, like a hook yanking hard on memory, I thought of the engagement party 6 months ago. The Pembroke estate in Newport Beach looked like a monument to glass and ego. I wore my prettiest floral dress, the one I saved for special occasions. But when I walked in, Jacqueline Pembroke looked at me like I was a stain on her pristine marble floor. She didn't introduce me to anyone. She didn't invite me to the main table. Instead, a server led me to a small round table shoved behind a large fern, right near the swinging door of the kitchen. "It's quieter here, Marcia," Jacqueline whispered, her smile never reaching her eyes. "We thought you'd be more comfortable away from the hustle." There are so many social nuances to navigate, aren't there? I sat there for 4 hours. I watched my son laugh with men in custom tuxedos. I watched him raise his glass to a future, without me. Tristan glanced toward my table exactly once, a quick, ashamed look, like I was something that needed to be hidden. Then he turned back to Ainsley, burying his own legacy in a vintage champagne flute. I stayed silent then. I told myself I was doing it for his happiness. I told myself a mother's job was to be a bridge, even when the people crossing that bridge never bent down to see what it was built from. But that bridge was collapsing right now. Have you ever fallen into this feeling, when you realize you're not hated with shouting, but erased with polite voices? Because Tristan did not curse me out. Jacqueline didn't need to make a scene. They only needed one thing, to make me believe I didn't fit the aesthetic, didn't fit the circle, didn't fit the future of my own son. And when you're excluded from the life of the person you love most, with words that light, the most painful part isn't the hurt, it's the waking up. And I had woken up. I stood abruptly and walked into the kitchen, my movements stiff like someone dragged out of a long dream. I looked at the tea kettle on the stove, the gift Tristan had bought me 5 Christmases ago. The last gift he gave me, that didn't come with a request for money. It was cheap, probably a rushed purchase from a drugstore on his way home. But I treasured it, because it felt like a small sign that at some point he still thought of me as his mother. I picked it up and threw it straight into the trash. The plastic hit the empty bin with a dry, hollow sound, not as satisfying as I'd imagined. Just empty. Exactly like the way Tristan's love had become empty. Why did he believe I would say yes? Was it because I always said yes? I had taught him that my love was a bottomless well, and now he was confused, furious, because he had finally hit the mud at the bottom. I needed someone, not to comfort me. I needed someone who understood the language of truth, like I understood the language of books, and I thought of Raymond Hollis. Ray was a retired forensic accountant, 55 years old. For 30 years, every Tuesday at 2 p.m., he came to the UCLA library to read financial journals. We had shared thousands of quiet conversations. 2 people who found comfort in order, Ray in ledgers, me in shelves. When his old navy blue sedan turned into my driveway at 8 a.m., I felt something I hadn't felt in days. It wasn't quite hope. It was ground. Something solid beneath my feet. Ray stepped out slowly, deliberately. He gripped a thick leather briefcase in his hand. He looked at my house, then at me on the porch. He gave a single serious nod. He knew. He didn't know details yet, but he knew the weight of a story going wrong. "Marcia," Ray said as he reached the top step. His voice was dry as autumn leaves, crisp but clear. "Last night you sounded like a woman who found a ghost on a bookshelf." "I found a whole graveyard, Ray," I said, stepping aside to let him in. "Please, the kettle's boiling." We sat at the heavy oak table in the dining room, the same table where I used to sit beside Tristan, helping him with homework, the same table where I'd sat in silence for the past 48 hours. Ray didn't need an introduction. He opened his briefcase and placed his laptop on the table. His fingers hovered over the keys, with the muscle memory of a man who had spent his life hunting truth between lines of text. I handed him the soaked wedding program I'd picked up from the Newport Beach resort, and the printed lawsuit filings I'd found. "My son's new family," I said, my voice barely a whisper now. "The Pembrokes. They say they have status. They say they're deserving." Ray adjusted his glasses. His eyes narrowed as he scanned the names. He didn't speak for a long time. Inside the house, the only sounds were the hallway clock ticking and distant traffic rumbling from Crenshaw Boulevard. I watched Ray work, watched his forehead crease as he pulled up databases I didn't even know existed. The silence in my home now was no longer the silence of abandonment. It was the silence of a laboratory. "Finally," Ray murmured, his lips twisting into a grim little smile. "Status. Interesting word, Marcia. In finance, status is often just a glossy coat of paint over a wall that's cracking." He looked up at me. "You've seen the tax debts, right? The IRS doesn't care about aesthetics. They care that Arthur Pembroke hasn't paid a single dollar of personal income tax since 2019. My throat went dry. "Is it as bad as I think?" I asked. Ray turned the laptop toward me. "Worse," he said clearly. "They're not just bankrupt, Marcia. They're insolvent. The resort they held the wedding at, it isn't theirs. It's owned by a Delaware company, one that Arthur is currently being sued for mismanagement." Ray typed a few lines, then pointed at the screen. "They've basically been siphoning corporate assets to stage an illusion. That offshore audit Tristan mentioned isn't an audit." He paused, as if to make sure I heard every word. "It's a freeze order from a bankruptcy court in the Cayman Islands." I felt the blood drain from my face. Ray finished in a cold, certain voice. "Marcia, they're a black hole. A black hole that has been swallowing the assets of anyone foolish enough to believe their lies." I sat frozen. So my son hadn't just married into a snobbish family. He had married into a sinking machine, and now they needed someone to use as a life raft. And me was the next target. They want $65,000 for the catering and the venue, I said, my voice hoarse because even I could hear how absurd it sounded. They said Tristan should ask me to borrow it. Ray let out a short laugh, sharp and cold as a knife's edge. Borrow? He repeated, as if the word were too innocent to exist in this house. How adorable! Marcia, if you give them that money, you will never see a single cent of it again. I stared at the faded floral wallpaper, a pattern I used to love, a pattern I once thought was warm. Now it looked like an old memory clinging to the walls. Ray continued, slow and clear, each word hammered in like a nail. Not because they don't want to pay you back, because they have nothing to pay with. Every dollar they have has already been spoken for, remember, by hundreds of creditors. They're not looking for a loan. They're looking for a benefactor. They're looking for a mother who loves her son so much she'll set herself on fire just to keep him warm. I heard that sentence, and in my mind I saw Tristan on the phone, calling me selfish, speaking as if I were the saboteur, as if I were ruining a beautiful moment for him. I thought of his voice at the airport, an unfamiliar arrogance I didn't recognize anymore. He believed the lie. No. He wanted the lie so badly he was willing to turn his own mother into the villain, just so the Pembrokes could play the heroes in his story. That realization hurt like a real stab deep in the joints of my bones. Tristan wasn't only a victim of the scam, he was an accomplice to his own illusion. They're coming here at 2:00, I told Ray. Jacqueline and Arthur, they said they want to help me manage my funds. They want to help me navigate my retirement assets. Ray's eyes sharpened instantly, as if a row of warning lights had just switched on inside his head. They're after the house, he said without detouring, a paid-off craftsman in Leimert Park. To people like the Pembrokes, that isn't a home. That's collateral. They'll try to get their names onto the deed or persuade you into a reverse mortgage so they can skim their share. They're desperate, and desperate people are always very good at making everything sound like they're doing you a favor. I stood, walked to the window. The thin clouds were breaking, and the Los Angeles sun pushed through, sharp and direct, like a blade of light cutting into the darkness inside me. And right then, I understood something that made me strangely calm. That deservingness Tristan kept talking about was never something I lacked. It was something they lacked. I had a whole life, quiet labor, 40 years of service. I had a home bought with honest wages. I had a history recorded in library archives and in the hearts of people I had helped. I was the one who was deserving, and they were empty. What do I do, Ray? I asked, and this time my voice didn't tremble the way it had before. I'm just a librarian. Ray stood and came to my side. He rested a hand on my shoulder, a light touch, but steady as an anchor. You're not just a librarian, Marcia, he said. You're someone who knows how to find anything. You're someone who understands that information is the only currency that never loses value. He looked straight at me. We're not giving them a check. We're giving them a mirror. I want you to imagine something. If at exactly 2 p.m. today, Jacqueline and Arthur walked into your home, bringing smiles, polite words, and a helpful plan that sounded very kind, what would you do? Would you fight them with emotion? Would you explode, cry, beg them, don't do this? Or would you do the one thing that scares con artists the most? You would make them answer questions. You would put documents on the table. You would force them to look straight at the truth. It took me many years to understand. Predators aren't afraid of screaming. They're afraid of light. And today, I plan to flip the switch. We spent the next 4 hours preparing. Ray showed me how to arrange the documents into a tactical sequence, not just stacking papers, but laying them out in the right order, so that every page turned would peel another layer off their mask. We didn't only have tax debts, we had the names of other mothers they had scammed. We had the details of a lawsuit from catering vendors in San Diego. We had evidence of corporate asset diversion. Ray helped me draft a set of questions designed to strip away each layer of aesthetic until the rot underneath was exposed to the light. And while we worked, I felt something changing inside me. The old reign of insecurity, something that used to make me shrink, was now striking sparks of self-respect. That spark didn't flare bright like it does in movies. It flared cold, steady, and dangerous. I looked at the photos on the mantel. For the first time, I didn't see the child I had lost. I saw a man who had made a choice, and choices have consequences. I would no longer be the silent bridge. I would be the wall he finally had to crash into. "You need to wear that dress," Ray said abruptly, pointing toward the box near the door. "The wedding dress?" I blinked. "The one I wasn't invited to wear?" "The one you bought for yourself," Ray corrected, perfectly calm. "Put it on, not for them, for you. Show them you are not a charmingly vintage relic that needs to be managed. Show them you are the mistress of this house, and your value is not something people can package into a logistical decision." I hesitated for a beat. Then I nodded. I went upstairs and put on the navy silk dress. It fit perfectly. The fabric was cool against my skin, as if reminding me I was still alive, and I still had the right to choose what touched me. I put on the pearl strand. I looked into the mirror. I didn't see a widow sitting at home waiting for loneliness. I saw a woman who had survived diner grease and library dust. I saw a woman armed with the truth. When I came downstairs, Ray stood. There was something like genuine admiration in his eyes. Not flattery, but the look people get when they see something being rebuilt. "Marcia Devereaux," he said softly, "you look like the ending of a very important book." "I feel like the beginning of one," I replied. Ray left at 1:30. He left his laptop and a thick folder on the table. "I'll be in my car parked down the street," he said. "If you need me, just open the front door. But I don't think you will." "You've spent 40 years organizing the world's stories. You know exactly how this one ends." I stood in the middle of the living room. The silence in the house was no longer loneliness. It was tactical energy, like electricity. I looked at the clock. 1:45. At exactly 2, the Pembrokes would arrive in their black SUV. They would climb the steps with pitying smiles and predatory intent. They would try to manage me. They would try to turn my retirement fund into their liquid assets. And in that moment, I realized the line Tristan had once said, "The Pembrokes are people of status," was, in truth, a tragedy. He confused reputation with excellence. He confused wealth with value. He saw the gold leaf on the program and didn't see the soaked paper beneath it. He wanted a mother who was an aesthetic, but he had a mother who was a vault of truth, and today, that vault would open. I went into the kitchen and brewed a fresh kettle of tea. I set out cups, the good cups, the kind that had lived in my family for generations. I no longer felt the phantom vibration of the phone. I no longer felt the weight of the not deserving label Tristan had pressed onto me. I felt like a librarian who had finally found a missing volume in a long-established collection, and this time I didn't intend to shelve it away again. I was ready. When I heard tires crunch onto the driveway at exactly 2 o'clock, I didn't flinch. I stood by the window and watched Jacqueline Pembroke step out of the SUV. Today she wore a different coat, a cream knit, probably worth more than my first year's salary at the library. Arthur walked beside her, tall, carrying the stiff, counterfeit confidence of a man who had never truly earned the room he entered. They looked like a magazine cover. They looked like the future Tristan wanted. I took a deep breath, smoothed the navy silk over my hips. I felt the weight of the pearls at my throat, weight that was no longer jewelry. It was armor. I walked straight to the front door and opened it before they could ring the bell. "Marcia!" Jacqueline sang, sweetly false like a practiced birdsong. She looked at me, eyes widening slightly at the dress and the firmness in my jaw. "Oh, you look adorable." "Are we going somewhere?" "We're not going anywhere, Jacqueline," I said, my voice deep and steady, like a library bell. "We're going to have a conversation about deservingness. Please, come in." They stepped into my house. Their eyes immediately swept the room, evaluating furniture, scanning paint, measuring value, as if this home were an item waiting to be appraised. I led them into the dining room, to the table where Ray's folders were spread out, neat, aligned, like a battle map. "Tristan is very worried about you, Marcia," Arthur said, and sat down without waiting to be invited. "He says you're having a hard time with the wedding finances. We understand. At your age, that's a lot to handle. But Jacqueline and I are here to help. We have a team in Newport Beach that specializes in this type of transition." "Transition," I repeated, taking my seat at the head of the table. "Interesting word, Arthur. A transition from what to what?" Jacqueline leaned forward, her smile tightening. "From a house that's too large for you, dear. From assets that just sit there doing nothing. We can help you put your money to work for Tristan, for Ainsley, for the family you're finally a part of." I looked at her, at the face sculpted into surgical precision, and I felt no fear anymore, only something close to pity. She was a ghost haunting a life she couldn't afford, a con artist, and today that con artist had chosen the wrong librarian, one who knew how to pull records. "I did a little research myself, Jacqueline," I said, and opened the first folder. "I am a librarian, after all. I'm very good at finding the things people try to hide in the dark." The room seemed to cool. Arthur's posture shifted, just slightly, but I saw it. Jacqueline's smile wavered. Her eyes flicked toward the folder like it might bite. "I found the tax debts, Arthur," I continued, calm enough to surprise even me. "I found the lawsuit from the catering vendors in San Diego. I found the freeze order on the liquid assets Tristan called an audit. It seems your hiccup is actually a collapse." I lifted my gaze, looking straight at them. "And I'm curious, does Tristan know? Does my son know he married into a family of darkness?" Arthur's face darkened. The fake confidence peeled away, revealing a sharp, desperate anger. "You don't understand what you're talking about, Marcia. You're just a library employee in a dusty suburb. You don't understand the complexity of high-level finance." "I understand a catering invoice, Arthur," I said, leaning forward. "And I understand that you're asking a widow to pay for a wedding you can't afford yourselves." I looked at each of them, unblinking. "I understand you're trying to take my house to pay for your vanity. And I understand that my deservingness is something you will never, ever be able to buy." The silence that followed was absolute. Los Angeles sunlight poured through the window, sharp and honest as a blade. I was no longer standing at the edge of a cliff. I was the one holding the mirror. And for the first time in their lives, the Pembrokes were forced to look straight into it, after the aesthetic had been stripped away. "I think you should leave," I said, my voice calm as steel. "This house, my house in Leimert Park, is no longer a resource for your transitions." I stood and walked them to the door. "My son's debt to your vanity has been canceled. But Tristan's debt to the truth is only beginning." I opened the door. Light spilled in, bright and unforgiving. "I suggest you find your own way to pay for the flowers, before they rot." Jacqueline rose, her face pale. Arthur didn't look at me. He only stared at the coffee cup as if it held the answer. As they stepped off of the porch, Jacqueline turned back, her lips parting as if she wanted to say something, but in the end, there was nothing to say. The aesthetic had cracked. The truth was out. I closed the door. And I locked it. Not with the angry click of rage. I locked it with quiet certainty, like a book returned to its proper shelf. I stood in the hallway. I didn't cry. I only felt a release so dizzying it was almost vertigo, like stepping out of an oxygenless room I'd lived in for far too long. I am Marcia Devereaux. I am a librarian. And finally, I am completely deserving of myself. The silence after the Pembrokes left wasn't peaceful. It was like a vacuum, an empty space that echoed, as if someone had sucked all the air out of the house and left me standing there, breathing hard, searching for something real to grab onto. I stood in the hallway for a long time, listening to rain hammer the windows. Rain in Los Angeles is rare, but today it returned, as if the sky itself needed to wash away the guilt of this day. My heart was panicking like a bird trapped inside a cage of ribs, but my mind was cold as a library, quiet, empty, and frightening. I realized I'd spent 40 years organizing the world by classification codes, believing that if everything had a place, everything would have meaning. But there is no code for a child's betrayal. There is no index entry for a son trading his mother's survival for a seat at a table made of smoke. I walked through every room of the house. The sound of my footsteps felt like an echo from another century. The house suddenly felt like a museum, one where my life had been systematically dismantled. I looked at the dining room wallpaper, the faded floral pattern Tristan helped me choose when he was 16. Back then he laughed at my hesitation, telling me anything I chose would be beautiful, because I was the one choosing it. Now those flowers looked like wilted eyes, watching me in isolation. To him, I was a bank. A resource, a logistical inconvenience in the high-end aesthetic he was chasing. My phone lay on the kitchen counter, black and still. I had turned it off, but I could still feel phantom vibrations, like Tristan's rage was still twitching in my palm. I could still hear that stranger's voice calling me selfish. Selfish. The word tasted like copper in my mouth. I thought about grease under my nails at the diner. I thought about dust settling in my lungs from the library basement. I thought about the thousands of miles I'd walked in cheap shoes, just so he could drive a car worth more than the income from my first decade of work. Irony is a serrated blade. I had built a man with my own hands, and now he was using the very tools I gave him to cut me out of his heart. A week passed in an order as quiet as a library. I kept my phone off and hid it in the kitchen drawer. I spent whole days in the yard, pruning rose bushes neglected through months of wedding drama. Ray came twice. We didn't talk much about the Pembrokes. We talked about his grandchild, about the history of Leimert Park, about the undeniable beauty of a ledger finally balancing. Over hot tea, Ray told me the wedding organizer had filed a lawsuit against the Pembrokes. He said Tristan and Ainsley had left their luxury apartment and moved into a small rental in Inglewood. The Newport Beach house turned out to be a fiction, a carrot Jacqueline dangled to keep Tristan hooked on the line. That paper house collapsed exactly as Ray predicted, and Tristan stood in the wreckage. Hearing that, I felt pain, not the pain of satisfaction, the pain of a mother's dark understanding. My son had traded a mother made of iron for a seat at a table that was already rotting. If you're listening this far, I want you to pause for a moment. Try to guess. 10 days later, when Tristan came back, what happened? What face does a son wear when he knocks after calling his mother selfish? A real apology? Or an apology with conditions? And most importantly, if you were me, would you open the door for maternal love or keep it closed for survival? I asked myself that all week, and on the 10th day, the answer stood on my front steps. On the 10th day, I heard a knock, not the forceful, entitled knock of Jacqueline Pembroke, a hesitant knock, shattered. I knew who was out there before my hand even touched the doorknob. I opened the door, my heart steady, my jaw set. Tristan stood there. He looked like he'd aged 10 years in a week. The linen shirt was gone. In its place was an old hoodie, one I remembered from his college days. His eyes were red-rimmed, sunken beneath bruised shadows of empty exhaustion. He no longer looked like someone with status. He looked like a boy who had finally realized the suit he wore didn't have pockets big enough to hide the truth. "Mom," he said. His voice cracked, stripped of all Newport Beach arrogance. "Mom, I came to apologize." I didn't invite him in. I stood at the threshold like the owner of the Devereaux archives, guarding the entrance to my life. "Hello, Tristan. I came to apologize," he repeated, eyes dropping to his shoes. "Everything you said was right. Arthur and Jacqueline, they're being investigated for fraud. Ainsley's father used my name on some shell companies. I might be held responsible for part of it. The wedding organizer is suing us." "Ainsley, He swallowed hard. She left. She said she can't be married to a man who can't even provide a basic lifestyle. She went to her aunt's place in California. I listened, and for the first time in his life, I didn't feel the urge to pull him into my arms. I didn't feel the phantom ache in my back from the days of bending over shelves. I felt only a cold, distant pity, like watching someone lost in the rain. "You traded your mother for a basic lifestyle, Tristan," I said. "Looks like the exchange rate wasn't in your favor." "Mom, please." He looked up, bewildered like a child. "I have nowhere to go. They froze my personal accounts because of the link to Arthur's businesses. I can't even pay rent in Inglewood. Can I stay here for a while? Just until I can get back on my feet. You always said this was my home, too." I looked at him. I saw the 12-year-old boy. But I also saw the man who had asked me to drain my retirement fund so he could raise a glass with people who couldn't stand the sight of me. I thought about the brunch he said would suit me better. I thought about the corner table behind the fern at the engagement party, and I understood. Some doors, once closed, are not closed out of hatred. They're closed out of survival. "No, Tristan," I said. The word fell like a clean cut. "This is not your home. This is Marcia Devereaux's home, a home built out of 30 years of library shifts and 40 years of honest silence. It is not a resource for your transitions. It is not a safety net for a man who tried to cut the rope while I was standing on it." Tristan blinked, as if slapped. "Mom, you're really going to throw your son out? After everything that's happened?" "You threw me out first, Tristan," I said, unshaken. "You threw me out of your wedding, out of your family, out of your heart. You decided I wasn't deserving of the person you wanted to become, and I decided you aren't deserving of the peace I have finally found. I'll pay you back." His words rushed out. "I'll work. I'll do anything." "I don't want your money, Tristan." I spoke slowly, each word clear. "I have $68,000. I have a pension. I have a house. What I don't have is the energy to be a footnote in another one of your tragedies." I held his gaze, not looking away. "You need to find your own deservingness, not Ainsley's version, not Jacqueline's, and certainly not mine. You need to go out into the rain and learn how to build your own castle from driftwood, and this time, don't ask me to pay for the stones." I closed the door. I didn't lock it with the angry click of rage. I locked it with quiet certainty, like a book returned to its rightful shelf. I stood in the hallway, and I didn't cry. I felt a release so dizzy it was almost vertigo. I had spent my whole life being an anchor, and I had just realized the ship I was anchoring was a ship that wanted to sink. Letting go, I wasn't only saving myself. I was giving Tristan the only thing he truly needed perceived, the chance to become real. But standing alone in that hallway, the release was still threaded with a low, aching pain, not the pain of a fresh wound, but the pain of losing a part of your body you've had for 35 years. I walked into the living room and sat in the chair that had once been my husband's. I closed my eyes and let myself feel everything, without flinching. The anger that Tristan had traded me away. The grief of all the years I lied to myself that his neglect was only busyness. The lingering guilt. Had I made this monster? Had I failed to teach him value because I was too busy protecting him from the cost of everything? And deepest, darkest, the pain of a mother realizing her child isn't who she thought he was. The boy who once promised to buy me a castle. That boy was dead. Maybe he had been dead for a long time, and I had spent years talking to a ghost, refusing to see the stranger standing in front of me. I sat in that chair for hours, as afternoon light sank into dusk, then into night. The house settled around me. The creaks, the groans of old wood, sounded like a lullaby. Finally, I stood. I went down to the basement and found the old box of Tristan's childhood things. I opened it and pulled out the charcoal suit. Now it looked so small, a miniature version of the man he had become. The fabric was stiff, blended with cheap polyester, rough beneath my fingertips. I remembered the blisters on my feet from the diner job. I remembered my heart lifting when he said he loved me, and then I realized, with a clarity that crushed, I had raised him to consume my soul. I was so busy protecting him from the world that I never taught him how to be part of me. I put the suit back into the box, gently, like returning an archaeological relic of a love that had been too blind to see it was destroying the very thing it held closest. I closed the box, slid it into the corner of the basement, and turned off the light. Some stories, I understood, don't belong on shelves anymore. Some stories have to remain in the dark, where they can't do any more harm. Weeks passed and turned into months. I didn't hear from Tristan anymore, at least not directly. Occasionally Ray would tell me, like a careful mailman, delivering only the exact amount of information I needed, so I would know. My son was still alive, still moving forward, in his own way. Ray said Tristan had taken a job as a site supervisor for a construction company in South LA, 12 hours a day, a small apartment, and most importantly, for the first time in his life, he began paying his own bills. In the quiet corners of my heart, I still hoped. I hoped Tristan was learning the smell of honest sweat and the weight of meaningful labor. I hoped he was understanding that a suit is only fabric, while integrity is the skin beneath it. But I also knew it was no longer my story. He had to write the next chapter with his own hands. I sold the navy silk dress, not out of anger, but out of release. With that money, I bought a first-class plane ticket to London. Suddenly I realized, for 40 years I had arranged journeys for other people, returning books on time, suggesting the right routes, placing their stories onto the proper shelves. And then I asked myself, what about me? I spent 3 weeks at the British Library, breathing in the scent of centuries of stories. The towering stacks reminded me of UCLA, but this time there was no pain, only a quiet gratitude for all the years I had given away. I walked through the ruins of Rome and realized even the greatest empires collapse when they are built on darkness. I stood before Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, still being rebuilt after the fire, and understood something I had only ever read in books before. Even the most sacred things can be burned to the ground, but the foundation can endure, and from that foundation, something new can grow. When I returned to Los Angeles, the fog was still there, crawling over the downtown buildings, but it no longer felt like a ghost. It felt like a curtain being drawn back. I sat in my garden. The roses bloomed right on schedule, full and lush, as if they didn't care at all how human lives break and get pieced back together. And I realized the scar in my heart was not a mark of shame. It was a mark of survival. It was the price I paid to finally belong to myself, completely. The house felt different too. Not smaller, but wider. Rooms that used to feel heavy with memory now felt like blank pages of a new book, one no one had the right to write for me anymore. I started volunteering at the local library once a week, not UCLA, where too many ghosts still wandered between the shelves, but the small library in Leimert Park, where I could help children choose the first book of their lives. There was a little girl, no more than 8, with braided hair and wide eyes that reminded me of Tristan on his best days. She asked me about a book with knights and castles. "You know," I said, kneeling down so I could look her in the eye, "the best castles aren't the ones you're given. They're the ones you build with your own hands." The girl nodded, serious and understanding in the way only children can be. Ray still visited regularly. We sat on the porch, drank tea, and talked about everything, and sometimes talked about nothing at all. Ray didn't ask about Tristan, and I didn't bring him up. Some wounds need quiet to heal. But one afternoon, when the setting sun turned the clouds gold and pink, Ray set his teacup down and looked straight at me. "Are you okay, Marcia?" he asked. Not the polite kind of question, the kind that comes from genuine care, the kind that can only come from decades of quiet trust. I thought for a long time, what is okay anyway? Finally, I said, "I'm becoming okay." Then I exhaled, as if I had confessed something important. "There's a difference," I continued. "Okay means everything goes back to how it was. But it can't, and maybe that's better." Ray nodded. You just did the hardest thing in the world. You set a boundary with the person you love most. That isn't selfish, Marcia. That's survival. If you're listening to this and you feel lighter and hurt at the same time, then I understand. Because everyone loves the rebirth part. Everyone wants the getting back up part. But few people tell the truth about the hardest part, the part where you get back up and you still want to fall, the part where you chose correctly, and at night you still ask yourself, was I too cruel? And in those nights, I learned something no book ever taught me clearly enough. Let me keep going, because if I said everything was easy, that would be a lie. It wouldn't be honest if I told you I didn't have nights lying awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering whether I had made a mistake. There were mornings I woke up, and in that hazy moment between sleep and waking, I forgot everything had changed. I forgot my son no longer belonged to the daily rhythm of my life. Then reality crashed down, heavy and cold. There were moments I wanted to pick up the phone, moments I wanted to run after Tristan, forgive him, open the door, so everything could go back to how it was. Because at least that before was familiar, even if it was toxic. But I didn't. Because I had learned, through years among books, through the stories of women who were strong and women who were fragile, of survivors and victims, that love should never be tied to losing yourself. Loving Tristan did not mean I had to accept being disrespected by him. Loving him did not mean I had to bankrupt myself to fund his illusions. And I realized something. Real love sometimes looks like letting go. Not because you don't care, but precisely because you care too much, so much that you can't keep allowing them to destroy themselves and drag you down with them. I started writing. Not a memoir. I wasn't ready, but notes, thoughts, lessons. I wrote about the signs I had ignored, the times Tristan stopped asking, "How are you today, Mom?" and only talked about himself. The times he forgot my birthday, but remembered every social event with the Pembrokes. The way he stopped saying thank you and started saying I need. I wrote about psychological inertia, how the brain will do anything to avoid facing a painful truth. How I had justified every neglect, every demand, every sign that my son was slowly becoming a stranger. Because justifying is always easier than facing. Easier to say he's busy than to say I'm no longer his priority. Easier to believe the illusion than to shatter it and accept that you must rebuild your world from fragments. But illusions always break in the end. The only question is, are you strong enough to survive the explosion? One day, while I was volunteering at the library, a woman approached me. Maybe she was around the age I had been in my 50s. Tired eyes, shoulders that looked like they'd been carrying something heavy for a long time. "Excuse me," she said hesitantly. "I heard some of the others here talking about you, about how you set boundaries with your son. I hope that isn't rude, but I'm struggling with my daughter. She's 32, still living at home, not working, and she keeps saying I owe her because I brought her into the world. I don't know what to do." I looked at her and saw myself 3 months earlier. Exhausted, drained, desperate just to have someone acknowledge that I was human too. "Do you have somewhere to sit?" I asked gently. We sat in a quiet corner of the library. And I told her my story, not all of it, because some wounds were still too fresh, but enough. I talked about learning the difference between loving and allowing, about understanding that sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone is to let them face the consequences of their own choices. "Our children aren't kids anymore," I said, "and we are not their guilty conscience or their savings account. We are human beings with lives and needs of our own, and teaching them that, by living it, might be the greatest gift we ever give." The woman started to cry, not the tears of grief, but the tears of someone who had finally been allowed to feel something other than guilt. After she left, I stayed sitting alone among the books, and suddenly I understood. My pain, my story, my struggle were not meaningless. If they could help someone else find the strength to stand up for herself, then maybe, in a strange way, it had value. Maybe that's how we transform pain, not by denying it and not by burying it, but by using it to light the path for someone else. I remembered what my husband said years ago before he died. "Marcia, your strength isn't that you never break. It's that you always find a way to rebuild." He was right, and I was rebuilding. Not like before, but maybe that was better. 6 months after the day I shut the door on Tristan, a letter arrived. Not an email, not a text. A handwritten letter. Plain paper, a plain envelope, no luxury logo, no trace of any high-end aesthetic. I held it in my hands and felt, very clearly, its weight. Not the weight of paper, but the weight of time. The weight of silence. The weight of things unsaid. The handwriting was Tristan's. I would recognize it anywhere. But it was different, too. No longer the confident, fast-skimming script of a man always rushing, always busy to the point of having no room left for sincerity. This handwriting was slow, deliberate, the handwriting of someone who had learned how to stop. I opened the envelope. "Dear Mom," the letter began. "I don't expect you to reply to this letter. I'm not even sure I deserve a reply, but there are things I need to say, whether you ever read them or not. I was wrong. Not just about the wedding, not just about the money. I was wrong about everything. I spent years trying to run from where I came from. I was ashamed of the small house, of the old car, of the way you spelled your name differently from the people in Newport Beach. I thought wealth would make me deserving. I thought if I climbed high enough, no one would look down and see the boy who wore torn shoes. But you know what? You taught me the most important thing, and I was too arrogant to listen. Value doesn't come from what you buy. It comes from what you build with your own hands. Now I build houses, truly build. I pour concrete. I lay bricks. My hands are getting calloused. My back hurts. And for the first time in my life, I sleep well at night. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I haven't even forgiven myself. But I want you to know you were right about everything. And that castle I promised when I was 12, I'm building it. But this time, I'm building it with stones I earned, not stones I took from someone else. One day, if I work hard enough, if I become the man I should become, maybe I can invite you to come see it. Not because it fits any aesthetic, but because it was built on the foundation you gave me: honesty, labor, and dignity. I love you. I've always loved you. I just needed to learn how to love myself first. Tristan. I folded the letter. Slowly, carefully. I didn't cry. I didn't. But I smiled. Just a small smile. Sad, light, and strangely, with a hint of hope. I don't know what the future will hold for my son and me. I don't know whether Tristan and I can find a real relationship again. And honestly, I'm no longer sure that's the most important part. Because what I've learned in these 6 months is not how to live without him, but how to live for myself. I was a librarian for 40 years. My job was to preserve the truth, protect records, make sure facts weren't twisted by the will of the powerful. And finally, I applied that principle to my own life. I am no longer a footnote in someone else's story. I am no longer the bridge people walk across without ever looking down. I am no longer a resource to be extracted until I'm empty. I am Marcia Devereaux. I am the woman who survived diner grease and library dust. I am the woman who learned how to say no after 40 years of only knowing how to say yes. I am the woman who found my own value, not in my son's approval, not in money, and not in being invited to glamorous parties, but in the simplest place, in the quiet of my own home, in the roses I planted with my own hands, in the ability to stand before a mirror and recognize the woman looking back. I stepped into the garden and stood under the Los Angeles sun. The warmth on my skin was real, honest. It wasn't trying to make me beautiful for anyone. That $65,000 invoice had long since disappeared, buried under junk mail and time. But its lesson remained, carved into my heart like an honorable scar. Deservingness is not something someone grants you, not something you buy with sacrifice, not something you earn by making yourself smaller so someone else can look bigger. Deservingness is something you recognize, Something you declare, something you protect, even when, and especially when, it means standing alone. And for the first time in 70 years of life, I am deserving. Not because someone says so, but because finally, after all those years, I believe it. And it turns out, that is the most important thing. True healing begins in the silent rubble of betrayal, where you are forced to face the truth that sometimes the hardest forgiveness is forgiving yourself for loving the wrong person. For decades, I confused sacrifice with obligation, and I confused allowance with devotion. I didn't realize that when I kept holding up a son who didn't want to stand, I was teaching him how to lean, until I broke. The light I found afterward wasn't a gift from anyone. It was a fire I had to spark myself, inside the cold of my own home. I am no longer a footnote. I am no longer an aesthetic. I am the woman who reclaimed her story from those who once tried to erase it. My deservingness was never a debt to be paid. It was dignity that I finally dared to acknowledge. If you're listening to this and your heart just sank for a beat because you too once had to learn how to say no to someone you love, then please subscribe and turn on the bell for me. Here, we tell stories not only to entertain, but to remind each other you are deserving too, even if you have to stand alone to protect that.